Zara, you're not welcome here anymore. We can't have someone like you around our children. You're dangerous, and we don't know what you're capable of. My sister Elena's words hit me like a sledgehammer as I stood on the front porch of our family home in Millbrook Heights, Colorado. The autumn evening air was crisp, but the chill I felt had nothing to do with the weather. Through the screen door, I could see my nephews, Marcus and Diego, peeking around the corner, their wide eyes filled with confusion as they watched their aunt being banished from the only home they'd ever known her to visit. "Elena, please," I said, my voice barely steady. "I don't understand what's happening. What did I do wrong? We were fine last week at Marcus's birthday party. You were laughing at my stories, asking me to stay for dinner. That was before we knew the truth about what you've been doing." Elena replied, her voice cold and final. Behind her, I could see our mother, Carmen Lopez, standing in the hallway with her arms crossed, nodding in approval. Even our youngest sister, Isabella, was there, looking at me with a mixture of fear and disappointment that made my stomach churn. "What truth?" I demanded, but Elena was already closing the door. "Don't contact us again, Zara. We've made our decision as a family. You're cut off completely." The lock clicked with a finality that seemed to echo through the quiet suburban neighborhood. I stood there for several minutes staring at the burgundy door that had welcomed me countless times over my 29 years of life. The same door where I'd knocked excitedly as a teenager to share my acceptance letter to Northwestern University. The same door where I'd brought my first boyfriend to meet the family. The same door where I'd cried on the doorstep after my father's funeral 5 years ago, finding comfort in my mother's arms. Now it was closed to me forever, and I had no idea why. As I walked back to my silver Honda Civic parked at the curb, I noticed Mrs. Rodriguez from next door watching me through her kitchen window. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away and pulled her curtains shut. Even the neighbors seemed to know something I didn't, something that had apparently branded me as dangerous in the eyes of everyone I cared about. My name is Zara Lopez, and until this moment, I thought I had a close, loving family. We'd had our disagreements over the years, sure, but nothing that seemed irreparable. I was the middle child, sandwiched between Elena, who was 32 and had always been the responsible one, and Isabella, who was 25 and was still finding her way in the world. Our mother, Carmen Lopez, had worked 2 jobs to put all 3 of us through college after our father died, and we'd always been proud of how tight-knit our family was, despite the challenges. But as I sat in my car in front of the house where I'd grown up, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my place in this family had just crumbled to dust. The drive back to my apartment in downtown Denver was a blur of confusion and hurt. I kept replaying the last few weeks in my mind, trying to figure out what could have triggered such a dramatic reaction. Had someone said something to them? Had they misunderstood something about my work? My personal life had been relatively quiet lately. I'd been so focused on my job that I barely had time for dating, let alone anything that could be considered dangerous. What made it even more confusing was that my family had never really understood what I did for work anyway. When people asked, I usually just told them I worked in government consulting or security analysis. It was easier than trying to explain the complexities of my actual role, and honestly, most of the time, it wasn't that interesting to discuss at family barbecues. My mother would proudly tell her friends that I worked for the government and made good money, but she'd never pressed for details beyond that. Elena had always been supportive, even if she didn't fully grasp what my work entailed. She joked that I was probably some kind of secret agent, and I'd laugh it off, telling her she watched too many movies. Isabella was more curious, sometimes asking if I ever met any celebrities or traveled to exotic locations for work. But I'd always deflected those questions with vague answers about paperwork and boring meetings. The truth was, my work was both mundane and more important than any of them realized, but I'd never seen any reason to burden them with the details, especially since so much of what I did required discretion anyway. As I pulled into the parking garage of my downtown apartment building, my phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, my heart leapt, hoping it might be Elena or Isabella having second thoughts, wanting to talk things through like the family I thought we were. Instead, it was from an unknown number. Miss Lopez, this is Agent Sarah Chen with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to speak with you urgently about a family matter. Please call me at your earliest convenience. I stared at the message, reading it 3 times before the words fully sunk in. The FBI wanted to talk to me about a family matter? But I'd just been banished from my family for being dangerous. The timing couldn't be a coincidence.
Something was very, very wrong, and I had the sinking feeling that whatever had caused my family to turn against me was about to get much more complicated. As I sat in my car in the dimly lit parking garage, I realized that this was just the beginning of what would become the most challenging period of my life, a time when everything I thought I knew about my family, my work, and myself would be turned completely upside down. The woman my family had just labeled as dangerous was about to discover that the truth was far more complex than any of us had imagined. I called Agent Chen back immediately, my hands trembling as I dialed the number. She answered on the second ring. "Ms. Lopez, thank you for calling so quickly. I understand this might be a difficult time for you, but I need to meet with you tonight if possible. There are some serious matters we need to discuss regarding your family's recent concerns about you." Agent Chen, I don't understand what's happening. My family just cut me off completely, calling me dangerous, and now the FBI wants to talk to me about it? What's going on? I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Can you meet me at the Starbucks on 16th Street in 30 minutes? I'll be wearing a navy blazer and carrying a red folder. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment, staring at the walls covered with my certifications and commendations that my family had never really paid attention to. What they didn't know, what I'd never fully explained to them, was exactly what my government consulting work actually entailed. My official title was Senior Counterterrorism Analyst with the Department of Homeland Security, working directly with federal task forces to identify and prevent domestic threats. For the past 6 years, I'd been part of an elite team that monitored suspicious activities, analyzed threat patterns, and helped coordinate responses to potential security risks across the Mountain West region. It wasn't glamorous work like in the movies. Most of my days were spent reviewing intelligence reports, analyzing social media patterns, tracking financial irregularities, and building profiles of individuals who might pose risks to national security. I worked long hours in a secure government facility in downtown Denver, often staying late to review case files or participate in conference calls with agents across the country. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family had just labeled me dangerous when my entire career had been dedicated to protecting people from actual danger. I'd helped identify 3 separate domestic terrorism plots over the past 2 years, contributed to investigations that prevented attacks on critical infrastructure, and received commendations from the Director of Homeland Security for my analytical work. But to my family, I was just Zara who worked some vague government job and couldn't talk much about the details due to security clearances they didn't really understand. When I missed family dinners because of urgent cases, they saw it as me choosing work over family. When I had to decline vacation trips because of active investigations, they thought I was being antisocial. When I couldn't share details about why I was stressed or excited about work developments, they assumed I was just being secretive for no good reason. The security clearance requirements meant I couldn't discuss specific cases, ongoing investigations, or even many of the general procedures we followed. Over the years, it had become easier to just give vague answers about paperwork and analysis, rather than try to explain why I couldn't tell them about the most important and fulfilling parts of my career. What my family also didn't know was that my work had recently shifted into a particularly sensitive area. 3 months ago, I'd been assigned to a joint FBI-DHS task force investigating a growing network of domestic extremists who had been recruiting members throughout Colorado and the surrounding states. The investigation, codenamed Operation Mountain Shield, involved monitoring online forums, tracking recruitment patterns, and identifying individuals who might be planning violent activities. It was challenging, important work that required absolute discretion. The extremist network we were tracking had already been linked to several incidents of vandalism targeting minority-owned businesses, and intelligence suggested they were escalating towards more serious violence. My role involved analyzing their communication patterns, identifying key influencers in their online communities, and helping develop profiles of individuals who might be moving from online rhetoric to actual planning. The work was sensitive enough that I'd been assigned a security detail on 2 occasions when specific threats had been made against task force members. My colleagues and I had been briefed about operational security, including warnings about how extremist groups sometimes target government employees' family members to gather intelligence or create pressure. But none of this was information I could share with Elena, Isabella, or my mother. They knew I had a security clearance, but they thought it was just bureaucratic formality, not something that actually impacted my daily life or put me in contact with genuinely dangerous people. As I drove to meet Agent Chen, I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow my work and my family's sudden rejection were connected. But how could they possibly know details about classified investigations? And even if they did, why would that make them think I was the dangerous one? Agent Chen was exactly where she said she'd be, a professional-looking woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a demeanor that immediately put me at ease despite the circumstances. She stood up as I approached, extending her hand with a firm handshake. "Ms. Lopez, thank you for calling so quickly. I understand this might be a difficult time for you, but I need to meet with you tonight if possible. There are some serious matters we need to discuss regarding your family's recent concerns about you."
Agent Chen, I need to understand what's happening. My family has never acted like this before, and now the FBI is involved? Are they in some kind of danger? Am I? She gestured for me to sit down, opening the red folder she'd been carrying. "Miss Lopez, what I'm about to tell you may be difficult to hear, but your family has been contacted by individuals claiming to have information about your work activities. These individuals have been spreading false information designed to make your family fear for their safety." My blood ran cold. What kind of false information? "Someone has been telling your family that you're involved in dangerous, potentially illegal activities. They've been led to believe that your government work involves you associating with criminals and terrorists in ways that could put your family at risk. They've been told that having contact with you makes them targets." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. But that's completely false. My work involves analyzing threats, not creating them. Who would do this, and why? Agent Chen's expression was grim. "That's exactly what we're trying to figure out. But Miss Lopez, I need you to understand something important. This appears to be a targeted disinformation campaign designed specifically to isolate you from your support system. In our experience, when extremist groups can't directly threaten a government employee, they sometimes try to destroy their personal relationships instead." The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too crowded. Everything I thought I understood about my family's rejection was crumbling, replaced by something much more sinister and complex than I'd imagined. The next morning, I woke up in my apartment feeling like I was living someone else's nightmare. Agent Chen's words kept echoing in my mind. Targeted disinformation campaign, extremist groups, isolation tactics. I'd spent my entire career analyzing these exact types of psychological operations when they were used against other people. Now I was the target. To understand how devastating this attack on my family relationships really was, I need to explain what the Lopez family meant to each other. We weren't just relatives who saw each other on holidays. We were genuinely close, the kind of family that other people envied. Growing up in Millbrook Heights, we'd been the house where all the neighborhood kids wanted to hang out. My mother, Carmen, worked as a nurse at Presbyterian General Hospital during the day and cleaned office buildings at night after my father died. But she somehow always had energy left over for us. She'd make enormous pots of pozole on Sundays, and our kitchen table would be surrounded not just the 3 of us girls, but also our friends, cousins, and whoever else needed a place to belong.
Elena had always been my protector. When I was 12 and got bullied at school for being too serious about my grades, Elena, who was 15 and popular with the older kids, made it clear that messing with her little sister was off limits. She taught me how to do my hair, helped me navigate middle school drama, and was the first person I called when I got accepted to Northwestern University with a full scholarship. After college, Elena had married her high school boyfriend, Miguel Herrera, and they'd bought a house just 3 blocks away from where we grew up. She'd become a kindergarten teacher, following in the footsteps of our beloved Aunt Rosa, and she was incredible with children. Her sons, Marcus and Diego, were the lights of our entire family's life. I was the aunt who brought educational toys that lit up and made noise, much to Elena's mock horror, and who always remembered which superhero each boy was obsessed with at any given moment. Isabella, our baby sister, had always been the free spirit of the family. She'd changed majors 3 times in college, spent a semester studying art in Barcelona, and currently worked as a graphic designer for a small marketing company in Boulder. She lived in a converted garage apartment behind a house near the University of Colorado campus, and her space was filled with canvases, half-finished sculptures, and plants she somehow managed to keep alive despite her chaotic schedule. What made our family special was how we'd maintain these close relationships despite our very different paths. Elena was the traditional one who'd stayed close to home, married young, and focused on family life. Isabella was the creative adventurer who was always trying new things and traveling whenever she could save up enough money. And I was the academic achiever who'd gone away for college and built a serious career in government service. But instead of these differences creating distance between us, they'd always been a source of strength. Elena would tease me about being too serious, but she was genuinely proud when I got promoted or received recognition at work. Isabella would show me her latest artwork and ask for my analytical perspective on her creative choices. I would help Elena with research for her classroom projects and give Isabella advice about financial planning and career decisions. Every month, we had what we called Sisters' Night, usually dinner at Elena's house while Miguel watched the boys, followed by wine and conversation that could last until 2 in the morning. We talked about everything. Elena's concerns about the boys' education, Isabella's latest romantic drama, my frustrations with bureaucracy at work, Mom's health, finances, future plans, childhood memories.
During these conversations, my sisters would sometimes ask me about my work, and I'd share what I could. I'd told them about the satisfaction of solving complex analytical puzzles, about working with brilliant colleagues from different agencies, about feeling like I was contributing to something important for national security. But I'd never been able to share the specific details that would have helped them understand exactly how significant my role was. "It sounds so mysterious," Isabella would say, "like you're living in a spy movie." "It's really not that exciting," I'd always reply. "Mostly just reading reports and writing memos." Elena, practical as always, was more concerned with work-life balance. "Just make sure you're not letting the job take over your whole life, Zara. You work too many late nights." What they didn't understand was that the late nights weren't about ambition or career advancement. They were about active investigations where delays could mean real people getting hurt. When I missed Marcus's school play because of an urgent briefing about a potential threat to a local synagogue, Elena saw it as me choosing work over family. She didn't know that my analysis had helped identify and arrest 3 individuals who were planning to vandalize the synagogue during a children's event. When I had to cancel our annual Sisters Weekend trip to Aspen because of Operation Mountain Shield developments, Isabella thought I was being unnecessarily rigid about vacation policies. She didn't know that the extremist network we were tracking had just made threats against a courthouse in Grand Junction, and my linguistic analysis of their online communications was crucial for determining which members were moving from rhetoric to planning actual violence. The security protocols that governed my work life had gradually created small barriers between me and my family. but I'd never imagined these barriers could be weaponized against me. I couldn't bring work friends to family gatherings because most of my colleagues had similar security restrictions. I couldn't explain why I sometimes seemed distracted during family events. Not because I didn't care, but because part of my mind was always processing the cases I was working on. Over the years, this had sometimes led to minor tensions. Mom occasionally worried that I was becoming too isolated, too focused on work. Elena sometimes felt like I was keeping secrets unnecessarily. Isabella wondered why I couldn't just relax and be more spontaneous about plans. But these were normal family dynamics, the kind of minor friction that exists in every close family. We'd always worked through our differences because we fundamentally trusted each other and knew that our love for each other was unconditional. That's what made this current situation so devastating. Someone had taken the small gaps in understanding that naturally existed because of my work requirements, and they'd turned those gaps into chasms of fear and suspicion. They'd convinced my family that my inability to share certain details wasn't about security protocols, it was because I was hiding something dangerous and threatening. As I sat in my apartment, looking at family photos covering my refrigerator, I realized that whoever had orchestrated this attack understood exactly how to destroy what mattered most to me. They hadn't threatened my career or my physical safety. They'd severed the relationships that gave my life meaning and purpose. The brilliant and insidious cruelty of it was that they'd turned my own family into the weapon against me. And until Agent Chen had explained what was happening, I had no idea I was even under attack. 2 days after my meeting with Agent Chen, I finally learned exactly how my family had been turned against me. The truth was more calculated and vicious than I could have imagined. It started with a phone call to my mother on a Tuesday morning, while she was getting ready for her shift at Presbyterian General Hospital. According to the detailed report Agent Chen later shared with me, the caller identified himself as Detective Robert Morrison from the Denver Police Department's Special Investigations Unit. Mrs. Lopez, I'm calling about your daughter Zara. We've been monitoring some concerning activities, and I need to speak with you about potential risks to your family's safety. My mother, who had always taught us to respect law enforcement and cooperate with authorities, immediately agreed to meet with Detective Morrison that afternoon. She even took a half-day off work, something she rarely did, because she was so worried about what this mysterious police officer might tell her about her middle daughter. The man who met my mother at a coffee shop on Federal Boulevard was professional, well-dressed, and carried what appeared to be legitimate police credentials. He had a folder full of documents, official-looking photographs, and spoke with the kind of authoritative confidence that convinced my mother she was dealing with a real detective investigating real crimes. Mrs. Lopez, I want you to understand that your daughter hasn't been charged with anything, and we're not saying she's committed any crimes. But her work with the government has put her in contact with some very dangerous people, and we have reason to believe that these associations may have compromised her judgment. The fake detective showed my mother photographs that he claimed were surveillance images of me meeting with known extremists and terrorist sympathizers. In reality, these were carefully doctored images that took legitimate photos of me meeting with confidential informants and government colleagues and manipulated them to look sinister and clandestine. Detective Morrison explained that my work required me to develop relationships with individuals who were under investigation for domestic terrorism. He told my mother that while this was technically part of my job, there were concerns that I had developed sympathies for the people I was supposed to be monitoring.
Sometimes, Mrs. Lopez, when law enforcement officers work undercover or develop sources in criminal organizations, they can lose perspective. They start to identify with the people they're supposed to be investigating. We call it going native, and it's a serious problem in counterterrorism work. He showed her transcripts of what he claimed were my communications with extremist group members. These documents, which I later learned were completely fabricated, made it appear that I was sharing government intelligence with dangerous individuals and possibly planning to participate in illegal activities myself. The concern, Mrs. Lopez, is that your daughter may be planning something that could put your entire family at risk. These extremist groups often target the families of law enforcement and government officials. If Zara has compromised her position, she may have inadvertently made you and your other daughters targets. My mother, who had spent her entire life working hard and staying out of trouble, was terrified by this information. The fake detective was careful to emphasize that they weren't accusing me of any crimes, but that the situation was fluid and potentially dangerous. We're asking family members to limit contact with Zara until we can determine the extent of her involvement with these groups. For your own safety and for the safety of your grandchildren, it would be best if you maintain distance until this investigation is resolved. Detective Morrison gave my mother a card with a phone number and told her to call immediately if I tried to contact the family or if she noticed any suspicious activity around her home or workplace. He stressed that this was a matter of national security and that she should not discuss the conversation with anyone except her immediate family members. That same day, Elena received a similar visit at Millbrook Elementary School. The fake detective waited until her lunch break and approached her in the school parking lot, showing her the same credentials and delivering a nearly identical message about me being a potential security risk. But with Elena, he was even more manipulative. He focused on her children, showing her photographs of what he claimed were surveillance images of Marcus and Diego being watched by associates of the extremist groups that Zara has been in contact with. Mrs. Herrera, we have reason to believe that your sister's activities may have put your children on the radar of some very dangerous people. These groups sometimes kidnap family members to use as leverage against government employees who have information they want. Elena, who would do anything to protect her sons, was immediately convinced that maintaining contact with me posed an unacceptable risk to Marcus and Diego. The fake detective reinforced this fear by showing her news articles about other cases where family members of government employees had been targeted by extremist groups. The safest thing for your children is to have no contact with your sister until this situation is resolved. These groups track communication patterns, so even phone calls or text messages could indicate to them that your family is still a viable target. Isabella received her visit 2 days later at the coffee shop where she often worked on her design projects near the University of Colorado campus. The approach with her was slightly different. The fake detective presented himself as someone who was trying to help me rather than investigate me. Miss Lopez, your sister is in serious trouble, and she may not even realize how serious it is. The people she's been working with have been using her, and now they're threatening to expose her involvement in illegal activities unless she continues to provide them with classified information. He told Isabella that I was essentially being blackmailed by extremist groups who had compromised me through my work, and that maintaining contact with family members would only make the situation worse. The best way to help Zara right now is to give her space to resolve the situation without putting your family at risk. These groups are tracking communication patterns, so even phone calls or text messages could indicate to them that your family is still a viable target. The sophistication of this psychological operation was remarkable and terrifying. Each family member received information that was tailored to their specific fears and concerns. My mother was told to worry about general family safety. Elena was manipulated through her protective instincts toward her children. Isabella was convinced that cutting contact was actually the best way to help me. All 3 visits happened within a span of 4 days, giving my family just enough time to compare notes and convince each other that the threat was real. The fake detective had provided each of them with enough evidence to make his story credible, and he'd carefully framed the situation so that maintaining contact with me seemed selfish and dangerous.
By the time they held their family meeting to decide how to handle the Zara situation, they were all convinced that I had become a security risk who needed to be isolated for everyone's protection. They saw cutting me off not as punishment, but as a necessary safety measure for the family, especially for Marcus and Diego. The evening when Elena told me I was dangerous and not welcome was the culmination of a week-long psychological warfare campaign that had turned my own family's love and protective instincts into weapons against me. They weren't rejecting me out of anger or disappointment. They were rejecting me out of fear, believing that maintaining a relationship with me could get their children killed.
When Agent Chen explained all of this to me, sitting in her FBI field office with the evidence spread across her desk, I finally understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just harassment or intimidation. It was a sophisticated intelligence operation designed to neutralize a federal counterterrorism analyst by destroying her support system and isolating her from the people who gave her life meaning and stability. The people who did this understood exactly how to hurt me in the most devastating way possible, and they'd succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. The week following my family's rejection became a masterclass in psychological isolation that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. What the extremist group had accomplished wasn't just cutting me off from my family. They'd systematically dismantled every aspect of my personal support system with surgical precision. The first consequence hit me at work. My supervisor, Director Janet Walsh, called me into her office 3 days after the family confrontation. Janet had always been a mentor to me, someone who understood the unique pressures of counterterrorism work and made sure her analysts had the support they needed to handle the emotional toll of our investigations. "Zara, I've noticed you seem distracted lately. Your analysis on the Mountain Shield case has been thorough, as always, but something feels different. Are you dealing with any personal security concerns I should know about?" I wanted desperately to tell her everything, about the fake detective, about my family's sudden fear of me, about feeling like I was living in an alternate reality where everything I thought I knew had been turned upside down. But Agent Chen had specifically instructed me not to discuss the investigation with my colleagues until the FBI could determine how the extremist group had obtained such detailed information about my work and personal life. "Just some family stress," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Nothing that affects my clearance or my ability to do the job." But that wasn't entirely true. For the first time in my 6-year career, I was struggling to maintain the emotional detachment necessary for effective analysis. When I reviewed intelligence reports about domestic extremist recruitment tactics, I found myself thinking about how those same tactics had been used against my own family. When I analyzed communication patterns between group members, I wondered if some of those communications might be about me. The isolation extended beyond my family to our broader social circle in ways I hadn't anticipated. My mother had apparently told her sister, my Aunt Rosa, about the police investigation involving me. Rosa, who had been like a second mother to me after my father died, stopped returning my calls. My cousin Marcus, who I'd always been close with, deleted me from his social media accounts without explanation. Elena's husband, Miguel, who had been like a brother to me since their marriage, sent me a brief text message. "Zara, Elena told me about the situation. We need to focus on protecting the boys right now. I hope you understand." That message hit me particularly hard because Miguel was a sensible, level-headed person who didn't make emotional decisions. If he was convinced I was a threat to his children, the fake detective's deception had been even more effective than I had realized. The social isolation extended to my neighborhood as well. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been avoiding me since the night Elena banished me from the family home, apparently lived next door to my mother's friend from church. Within days, several people in my apartment building began treating me differently. The friendly maintenance worker who usually chatted with me about his grandson became coldly professional. The woman who lived across the hall and often borrowed sugar stopped making eye contact in the hallway. I realized that my mother, in her fear and concern, had probably shared her worries with close friends, asking for prayers for the family during this difficult time. In a tight-knit community like ours, word traveled fast, and the story probably grew more dramatic with each retelling.
People who had known me for years were now looking at me like I might be dangerous, without having any idea what I was supposedly dangerous about. The professional consequences began to compound the personal ones. While my direct colleagues at the Department of Homeland Security didn't know about my family situation, they couldn't help but notice changes in my behavior. I'd always been someone who worked well in collaborative teams, contributing to brainstorming sessions and offering insights that helped advance investigations. But now I found myself second-guessing every observation, wondering if my personal situation was affecting my professional judgment. During a crucial briefing about Mountain Shield developments, I hesitated to share an important pattern I'd noticed in the extremist group's communications because I was afraid my colleagues might think my analysis was influenced by personal bias. That hesitation could have cost us valuable investigative time, and it made me realize how thoroughly the attack on my personal life was beginning to undermine my professional effectiveness. The psychological toll was enormous. I'd always been someone who processed stress by talking through problems with family and friends. Elena had been my sounding board for work frustrations I could share without violating security protocols. Isabella had been my escape from the intensity of counterterrorism work, always ready with art projects or spontaneous adventures that helped me maintain perspective. My mother had been my anchor, the person who reminded me that no matter how challenging my work became, I had a family who loved and supported me. Now I had none of that. I was dealing with the most personal and frightening experience of my life while completely cut off from my usual support systems. The people who knew me best and loved me most had been convinced that I was someone to be feared rather than helped.
The irony was devastating. In my professional life, I was part of a team working around the clock to protect communities from the very kinds of people who were now attacking me. I spent my days analyzing threats and developing strategies to keep families safe from extremist violence. But when I came home each evening to my empty apartment, I was facing the consequences of an extremist attack on my own life, with no family support, no community understanding, and no way to explain what was really happening without potentially compromising an ongoing investigation. Sleep became nearly impossible. I'd lie awake at night thinking about Marcus and Diego, wondering if they understood why their Aunt Zara had suddenly disappeared from their lives. I worried about my mother, who was probably losing sleep herself, convinced that her daughter had somehow become involved with dangerous criminals. I imagined Elena struggling with the decision to cut me off, probably feeling guilty, but also terrified that maintaining contact might put her children at risk. The extremist group had succeeded in creating exactly the kind of emotional and psychological pressure that could force a federal agent to make mistakes, compromise investigations, or even leave their position entirely. They'd turned my greatest strength, my close family relationships, into my greatest vulnerability. By the end of that first week, I understood why Agent Chen had been so concerned about the sophistication of this operation. This wasn't random harassment or intimidation. This was a carefully planned psychological warfare campaign designed to neutralize a federal counterterrorism analyst by destroying her personal life and emotional stability. And it was working exactly as they had planned. The call that would change everything came at 6:23 a.m. on a rainy Thursday morning, exactly 10 days after my family had cut me off. I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I tried to summon the energy to get ready for another day of pretending everything was normal at work. The phone number was local but unfamiliar, and my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. I'd been getting occasional hang-up calls over the past few days, which Agent Chen had warned me might be part of the harassment campaign. But something made me answer on the fourth ring. "Is this Zara Lopez?" The voice was elderly, female, and trembling with what sounded like fear or urgency. "Yes, this is Zara. Who is this?" "My name is Dorothy Kellerman. I live on Maple Street in Millbrook Heights, just 2 blocks from your mother's house. I need to speak with you about something that happened in my neighborhood, something involving a man who said he was a police detective." My blood went cold. "Mrs. Kellerman, what exactly did this man tell you?" "He came to my door 3 days ago, asking questions about your family.
He said he was investigating suspicious activities and wanted to know if I'd noticed anything unusual about people coming and going from your mother's house. But something about him didn't feel right. And after he left, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Dorothy Kellenen turned out to be a retired librarian who had lived in Millbrook Heights for 43 years. She knew everyone in the neighborhood, had watched Elena and Isabella and me grow up, and had developed the kind of sharp observational skills that come from decades of managing public libraries and dealing with people from all walks of life. The man who came to my door looked official, but something about his questions bothered me. He wasn't asking about crimes or safety issues. He was asking very specific things about your family's routines, about when your mother left for work, about when your sister Elena picked up her children from school. It felt more like surveillance than investigation. I gripped the phone tighter. Mrs. Kellerman, did this man show you any identification? He did, and it looked legitimate, but after he left, I called the Denver Police Department to verify that they had a Detective Morrison working in special investigations. The desk sergeant told me they don't have anyone by that name in that unit. In fact, they told me they haven't had any active investigations in our neighborhood for months. The confirmation that the fake detective was indeed fake should have been reassuring, but instead it filled me with a new kind of dread. If Mrs. Kellerman had figured out the deception, how many other people in the neighborhood had been contacted? And more importantly, what other lies had been told that I wasn't aware of? Mrs. Kellerman, why are you calling me instead of the police? There was a long pause before she answered. Because when I called the police back to report the fake detective, they transferred me to someone in their fraud department. The officer I spoke to seemed very interested in what I had to say, and she asked me a lot of questions about you and your family. At the end of the conversation, she gave me a number to call if I had any more information. When I called that number, it connected me to the FBI. The pieces were starting to come together, but they weren't forming the picture I'd expected. The FBI told you to call me? Not exactly. The FBI agent I spoke with, a woman named Sarah Chen, explained that there was an ongoing investigation involving false information being spread about federal employees. She said if I was comfortable doing so, I might consider reaching out to you directly because you were probably unaware of the extent of the disinformation campaign targeting you. Agent Chen had been busier than I had realized. While I had been struggling with isolation and confusion, she had apparently been conducting her own investigation into the fake detective's activities in my family's neighborhood. Mrs. Kellerman, what else did this fake detective tell you about me?
He said you were under investigation for associating with dangerous criminals and that your family was potentially at risk because of your work. He asked me to call a phone number if I saw you visiting the neighborhood, or if I noticed any suspicious people around your mother's house. He made it sound like you might bring dangerous people to the area who could threaten other families. This was worse than I'd thought. The fake detective hadn't just targeted my immediate family. He'd been systematically spreading false information throughout my childhood neighborhood, creating a network of people who would monitor and report on my activities. He also asked me about your childhood, Mrs. Kellerman continued. He wanted to know if you'd ever displayed violent behavior, if you'd ever been in trouble with authorities, if there had been any incidents that might indicate antisocial tendencies. I told him that was absolutely ridiculous. I've known you since you were 7 years old, and you were always one of the most responsible, kind children in the neighborhood. The conversation with Mrs. Kellerman lasted over an hour, and with each detail she shared, I realized how comprehensive and sophisticated the attack on my reputation had been. The fake detective had visited at least 12 houses in my mother's neighborhood, targeting longtime residents who would be most likely to have influence with other community members. He'd told each person a slightly different version of the story tailored to their specific relationship with my family. Mrs. Kellerman, who was known for her civic-mindedness, had been told that I might be planning activities that could endanger the entire neighborhood.
Mr. Patterson, who lived across the street from my mother and was always concerned about property values, had been told that my associates might include people who would engage in criminal activities that could affect the safety and reputation of Millbrook Heights. The fake detective had even visited Father Miguel at St. Catherine's Catholic Church, where my family had attended Mass for decades. He'd told the priest that I was involved with people who had made threats against religious institutions, and that continuing to welcome my family at church services might put the congregation at risk. The most disturbing part, Mrs. Kellerman told me, was how much he seemed to know about you and your family. He knew about your work with the government, about Elena's job at the elementary school, about your mother's schedule at the hospital. He knew personal details that suggested he'd been watching your family for quite some time. As I listened to Mrs. Kellerman describe the fake detective's knowledge of my family's daily routines, I realized that this operation had been planned and executed with the kind of intelligence-gathering capabilities that suggested serious resources and sophisticated coordination. This wasn't the work of amateur extremists. This was a professional-level psychological warfare campaign. Mrs. Kellerman, I can't thank you enough for calling me, but I have to ask, are you concerned about your own safety? If these people are as dangerous as they seem, contacting me might put you at risk. My dear, I'm 78 years old, and I've lived through enough history to recognize evil when I see it. What they're doing to you and your family is wrong, and I won't be intimidated to stay silent. Besides, she added with a note of steel in her voice, Agent Chen assured me that the FBI is taking this very seriously. After hanging up with Mrs. Kellerman, I sat in my kitchen processing the implications of what she had told me. The fake detective hadn't just attacked my family relationships. They'd systematically poisoned my entire community against me. They'd turned neighbors who had watched me grow up into unwitting surveillance assets. And they'd done it so effectively that people were calling FBI tip lines to report on my activities. But Mrs. Kellerman's call had also given me something I'd lost over the past week and a half: hope. For the first time since this nightmare began, someone who knew me personally had seen through the lies and taken action to help me. She'd connected the dots, verified the deception, and reached out despite potential risks to herself. More importantly, her call confirmed that Agent Chen and the FBI were actively investigating the people responsible for destroying my life. I wasn't as alone as I thought, and the truth was beginning to emerge from beneath the layers of sophisticated lies that had been built around me. The fake detective had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated a sharp-eyed retired librarian who understood the difference between legitimate law enforcement and psychological manipulation. Agent Chen called me within 2 hours of Mrs. Kellerman's phone call, asking me to come to the FBI field office immediately for an emergency briefing. Her voice carried an urgency that made my stomach drop. Something significant had happened, and I had the feeling it wasn't good news. The FBI building on Stout Street downtown had always felt imposing, but that morning it felt like a fortress. Agent Chen met me in the lobby personally, which was unusual, and escorted me through security with an efficiency that suggested she'd cleared my visit through several levels of bureaucracy. Zara, we've had a major breakthrough in the investigation, but it's also revealed that this situation is much more serious than we initially realized. What I'm about to show you is classified information that directly relates to your safety and your family's safety. The conference room she led me to was filled with documents, photographs, and computer printouts arranged across multiple tables. 3 other agents were present, including Agent Marcus Rivera, whom Chen introduced as a specialist in domestic terrorism financing, and Agent Lisa Wong, who worked in counterintelligence operations.
Zara, we've identified the group responsible for the disinformation campaign against you, Agent Chen began, opening a thick folder. They call themselves the Patriot Reformation Network, and they're significantly more sophisticated than the typical domestic extremist groups we usually deal with. She showed me an organizational chart that looked like something from a major corporation rather than a terrorist cell. The Patriot Reformation Network had operational divisions, financial planning committees, and what appeared to be a dedicated intelligence wing focused specifically on targeting federal law enforcement personnel. This group has been operating for approximately 3 years, Agent Rivera explained, and they've developed capabilities that rival some foreign intelligence services. They have members with backgrounds in military intelligence, corporate security, and even some with former law enforcement experience. The scope of their operations was staggering. Over the past 18 months, the Patriot Reformation Network had targeted 47 different federal employees across 6 states, using variations of the same disinformation tactics they deployed against me. FBI agents, DEA officers, ATS investigators, and DHS analysts had all been subjected to campaigns designed to isolate them from their families and communities. The pattern is always the same, Agent Wong said, pointing to a timeline on the wall. They select federal employees who are working on cases that threaten their interests. They conduct extensive surveillance to map out family relationships and community connections. Then they deploy false flag operations designed to turn the target's support system against them. In my case, the targeting had begun 4 months earlier, when my analysis had helped identify key financial networks that the Patriot Reformation Network was using to fund their operations. My work on Operation Mountain Shield had led to the freezing of several bank accounts and the arrest of 3 individuals who were laundering money for extremist activities throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Your analytical work cost them approximately $2.3 million in operational funding, Agent Chen explained. More importantly, your identification of their financial patterns has helped us track other cells in Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico. You've been more effective against their operations than they can tolerate. The fake detective Morrison was actually Thomas Brennan, a former Denver police detective who had been fired 3 years earlier for falsifying evidence in drug cases. After his dismissal, Brennan had become increasingly radical, eventually joining the Patriot Reformation Network and becoming their primary specialist in what they called neutralization operations, campaigns designed to destroy federal employees' effectiveness without resorting to physical violence. Brennan is exceptionally good at his job, Agent Rivera said grimly. He understands law enforcement procedures well enough to create convincing false credentials and documentation. He knows how to manipulate people's fears and protective instincts, and he has access to surveillance equipment and techniques that make his operations extremely difficult to detect. The evidence they showed me was overwhelming and terrifying. Brennan had been watching my family for 6 weeks before initiating contact with them. He knew my mother's work schedule, Elena's pickup routines for her children, Isabella's favorite coffee shops, even Miguel's weekend jogging route through the neighborhood. They had your apartment under surveillance as well, Agent Wong added, showing me photographs that had clearly been taken with telephoto lenses from a building across the street. They documented your daily routines, your grocery shopping habits, the times you typically left for work and returned home. But the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. The Patriot Reformation Network hadn't just been gathering intelligence for the disinformation campaign. They'd been planning what they called an escalation scenario in case the psychological warfare tactics weren't sufficient to neutralize my effectiveness. Agent Chen opened another folder, this one marked with red classification stamps. 2 weeks ago, we intercepted communications indicating that if the family isolation campaign didn't succeed in forcing you to resign from your position or request to transfer, they were prepared to move to what they termed direct action. The direct action plan was a sophisticated false flag operation that would have framed me for providing classified information to terrorist organizations. They had already created fake communications, doctored financial records, and prepared false evidence that would have made it appear that I was selling government secrets to fund a lavish lifestyle. The plan was to plant evidence in your apartment and vehicle, then trigger an investigation that would result in your arrest on federal espionage charges. Even if the charges were eventually dismissed, the investigation process would have destroyed your career and subjected you to years of legal proceedings. As backup to the false flag operation, they had also prepared what they called a terminal solution, a plan to make my death appear to be suicide brought on by guilt over betraying my country. The level of detail in this plan was genuinely chilling, including forged suicide notes and carefully planned circumstances that would have made law enforcement conclude I had taken my own life rather than face prosecution for treason. The only reason these plans were implemented, Agent Chen said, is that your family's rejection of you was so complete and happened so quickly that they believed the psychological campaign had succeeded beyond their expectations. They thought you would either resign from your position or suffer a mental breakdown that would make you ineffective in your work.
The room fell silent as I absorbed the full implications of what they were telling me. The extremist group hadn't just destroyed my family relationships as a form of harassment. They'd done it as the first phase of a comprehensive operation that could have ended with my death. How close did they come to implementing the escalation plans? I asked, my voice barely steady.
Closer than we'd like, Agent Wong replied. We found evidence that Brennan had already prepared the materials needed for planting evidence in your apartment. He was waiting for authorization from the network's leadership to proceed to the next phase. Agent Chen leaned forward, her expression serious. Zara, what I need you to understand is that your situation isn't unique, but it is particularly dangerous because of how effective your work has been against their operations. Of the 47 federal employees they've targeted, you're one of only 3 who have had escalation plans developed against them. The revelation that I'd been marked for potential assassination because of my analytical work should have been terrifying, but instead I felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in 2 weeks, everything made sense. My family's rejection, the community's suspicion, the professional isolation, all of it had been carefully orchestrated by people who saw my work as a serious threat to their criminal operations. What happens now? I asked. Now we take them down, Agent Chen replied with grim determination. But first, we need to protect you and undo the damage they've done to your family relationships. And for that, we're going to need your help. The next 72 hours transformed me from a victim of psychological warfare into an active participant in dismantling the network that had destroyed my life. Agent Chen made it clear that my cooperation wasn't just helpful, it was essential for building the kind of comprehensive case that would put the Patriot Reformation Network out of business permanently. We need your analytical skills, Zara, Agent Chen explained as she spread out intelligence reports across the conference table. You understand their operational patterns better than anyone because you've been living inside one of their campaigns. We need you to help us see connections and vulnerabilities that we might miss. The first step was conducting a complete forensic analysis of everything that had happened to me and my family. Agent Wong had assembled a timeline that stretched back 6 months, identifying every point where the Patriot Reformation Network had gathered intelligence, made contact, or influenced events in my life. We've been monitoring their communications for 3 weeks, Agent Rivera explained, pointing to transcripts of intercepted phone calls and encrypted messages. But we need help interpreting some of their operational codes and understanding the significance of certain references they make to your case. Reading through the intercepted communications was like looking into a funhouse version of my own life. The extremist group had assigned me a code name, Analyst 7, and tracked every aspect of my work performance, family relationships, and daily routines with clinical precision. One particularly chilling document was titled Analyst 7 Psychological Profile and Vulnerability Assessment. It read like something from a psychological warfare manual, identifying my close family relationships as my primary weakness and recommended specific tactics for exploiting those bonds. One section read, Subject exhibits strong family loyalty patterns typical of Hispanic cultural background. Mother figure represents primary authority influence. Sister relationships provide emotional stability and identity validation. Recommend targeting protective instincts toward children, nephews, as most effective leverage point. The level of cultural and psychological analysis was sophisticated enough to rival intelligence operations conducted by foreign governments. These weren't amateur extremists acting on impulse. They were conducting professional-grade psychological operations with specific strategic objectives. How did they get this level of detailed information about me? I asked, studying documents that contained personal details I couldn't remember sharing with anyone outside my immediate family. Agent Chen exchanged glances with her colleagues before answering. That's one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. They appear to have infiltrated several government databases and social media platforms to build comprehensive profiles of their targets. The investigation revealed that the Patriot Reformation Network had members working in data analytics companies, telecommunications firms, and even some government contractor positions that gave them access to personal information that should have been secure. Thomas Brennan wasn't working alone when he approached your family.
He had a support team that included a former NSA contractor who specialized in data mining, a retired Army psychological operations specialist, and someone with access to law enforcement databases who could create convincing false credentials. As we dug deeper into their operation, I began to understand why the FBI was treating this case as a matter of national security rather than just domestic terrorism. The Patriot Reformation Network had developed capabilities that threatened the effectiveness of federal law enforcement across multiple agencies and jurisdictions. They've successfully forced 12 federal employees to resign or transfer to less sensitive positions over the past 18 months. 3 others have suffered mental health breakdowns that required extended medical leave. The cumulative impact on our counterterrorism operations has been significant. My role in the investigation became increasingly important as I helped the FBI team understand the psychological tactics being used and identify potential countermeasures. My background in threat analysis proved invaluable for recognizing patterns in the extremist group's communications and predicting their likely next moves. "Look at this communication from 2 days ago," I said, pointing to an intercepted message that had initially puzzled the FBI analysts. They're discussing adjusting the family pressure parameters for Analyst 7. That's not about escalating the campaign against me. They're worried that the isolation has been too effective.
The message revealed that the extremist group was concerned that my family's complete rejection might actually drive me to seek support from law enforcement or other government colleagues, potentially exposing their operation. They were planning to have Brennan make follow-up contact with my family to encourage them to maintain minimal communication with me, just enough to keep me emotionally destabilized, but not enough to push me toward seeking official help. "They want to keep you in a psychological sweet spot," Agent Chen observed, "isolated enough to be ineffective, but not so isolated that you become desperate enough to take actions that might expose them." This insight helped us understand why several other targeted federal employees had never reported the harassment they were experiencing. The extremist group had calibrated their campaigns to create just enough family discord to undermine their target's effectiveness, while maintaining plausible deniability about any organized conspiracy. Working with the FBI team also revealed the broader scope of what the Patriot Reformation Network was trying to accomplish. Their attacks on individual federal employees were part of a larger strategy to degrade law enforcement capabilities from within, making it easier for them to conduct other criminal activities without detection. They're not just trying to stop specific investigations, Agent Wong explained during one of our analysis sessions. They're trying to create an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust that makes federal law enforcement less effective overall. If agents can't trust their personal relationships, if they're constantly worried about family safety, if they're isolated from community support systems, they become less effective at their jobs. The investigation also uncovered evidence that the Patriot Reformation Network was sharing their psychological warfare techniques with other extremist groups across the country. They'd created training materials, tactical guides, and even offered consulting services to help other organizations target federal employees in their regions. "This isn't just about Colorado or the Mountain West region," Agent Rivera said, showing me documents that indicated similar operations in Texas, Florida, and the Pacific Northwest. They're trying to franchise this model of attacks against federal law enforcement. Perhaps most importantly, our investigation revealed that the network was planning to expand their operations significantly over the coming months. Intelligence intercepts indicated they were preparing to target federal employees working on election security, immigration enforcement, and financial crimes investigations. "Your case has become a proof of concept for them," Agent Chen explained. "If they can neutralize a senior counterterrorism analyst using psychological warfare tactics, they believe they can scale up these operations against much larger numbers of federal employees." By the end of the 3rd day of intensive investigation, we'd assembled enough evidence to understand not just what happened to me, but what the Patriot Reformation Network was planning to do to dozens of other federal employees and their families. The scope of their ambitions was genuinely frightening, but our analysis had also identified critical vulnerabilities in their operations. "We have enough evidence to start making arrests," Agent Chen announced during our final planning session,
But first, we need to execute a coordinated operation to protect all of their current targets and gather enough intelligence to dismantle their entire network. What about my family? How do we undo the damage they've done? Agent Chen smiled for the first time since I had met her. That's where things get interesting, Zara. We're going to use their own tactics against them, and your family is going to play a crucial role in bringing down the people who destroyed your relationships. The investigation phase was complete. Now it was time to turn the tables on the Patriot Reformation Network and show them what happened when they targeted the wrong federal employee. The confrontation with my family was scheduled for 3 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon at Elena's house, the same house where I'd been banished from their lives just 2 weeks earlier. But this time, I wouldn't be arriving alone, and I wouldn't be begging for understanding. This time, I was coming with federal agents, evidence, and the full weight of the United States government behind me. Agent Chen had spent 3 days carefully orchestrating what she called the revelation operation. It wasn't enough to simply tell my family that they'd been deceived. We needed to demonstrate the scope and sophistication of the deception in a way that would help them understand how skilled manipulators had exploited their love for each other. The psychological impact of discovering you've been manipulated this effectively can be devastating. Dr. Amanda Foster, the FBI's behavioral psychology consultant, had warned during our preparation meetings. Your family members are going to experience a complex mix of relief, guilt, anger, and embarrassment. We need to present this information in a way that helps them process those emotions constructively. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Agent Chen would contact my mother directly, identifying herself as FBI and requesting an urgent family meeting about serious threats that have been made against the Lopez family. She'd ask Elena and Isabella to be present, but wouldn't reveal the full nature of the meeting until everyone was assembled. We want them to experience the same fear and confusion they put you through, Agent Rivera had explained, but we'll resolve it quickly with truth instead of lies. Miguel answered the door when we arrived, his face cycling through confusion, concern, and wariness as he saw me standing behind 3 federal agents in business suits. The children were nowhere to be seen, which Elena had apparently arranged after Agent Chen's call had convinced her that genuine law enforcement was involved. Elena, Isabella, Mrs. Lopez, Agent Chen said as we entered the familiar living room where I'd spent countless Sunday dinners. Thank you for meeting with us on short notice. I'm Special Agent Sarah Chen with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is Agent Rivera and Agent Wong. We're here to discuss a serious criminal matter that has directly affected your family.
My mother looked smaller than I remembered, sitting on the edge of the sofa with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Isabella had positioned herself near the window, as if she needed an escape route. Elena stood protectively near the hallway that led to the children's rooms, her maternal instincts still on high alert, even though Marcus and Diego were at Miguel's parents' house. Mrs. Lopez, 2 weeks ago you were contacted by a man who identified himself as Detective Robert Morrison from the Denver Police Department, Agent Chen began, opening the folder that contained Thomas Brennan's photograph and arrest record. That man was not a police officer. His real name is Thomas Brennan, and he's a domestic terrorist who was using psychological warfare tactics against your daughter. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. Elena's face went white, and Isabella actually took a step backward, bumping into the window frame. I don't understand, my mother said, her voice barely audible. He showed us identification. He had official documents. He knew things about Zara's work that only law enforcement would know. Agent Wong stepped forward with a tablet computer, showing them side-by-side photos of Thomas Brennan's fake police credentials and his actual arrest photo from 3 days earlier. Brennan is a former Denver police detective who was fired for corruption. He's been using his knowledge of law enforcement procedures to create convincing false identities. Everything he told you about Zara was a lie, Agent Rivera continued. She's not under investigation. She's not associating with criminals or terrorists. In fact, she's been working to protect families like yours from the very people who targeted her. Elena finally found her voice. But he knew so much about our routines, about the children's schedules, about Zara's work. How could he know all of that if he wasn't really investigating her? Because he'd been conducting surveillance on your family for 6 weeks before he made contact,
Agent Shen replied, producing photographs that made Elena gasp audibly. This picture was taken from across the street from your children's school. This one shows your mother leaving Presbyterian General Hospital after her evening shift. This one shows Zara entering her apartment building. As the agents systematically dismantled every piece of the deception that had torn our family apart, I watched my mother, sister, and Isabella process the magnitude of what had been done to them. The initial shock gave way to a growing understanding of how thoroughly they'd been manipulated, and then to a rising anger that was both heartening and heartbreaking to witness. "You telling me," said Elena slowly, "that we cut Zara out of our lives because we believed a criminal who was trying to hurt her? Not just trying to hurt her," Agent Wong clarified, "trying to destroy her effectiveness as a federal counterterrorism analyst. Your rejection of Zara was the first phase of an operation that could have ended with her death." Isabella had been silent throughout most of the presentation, but at this revelation she broke down completely. "Oh my God, Zara, what have we done? We thought we were protecting the family, protecting the children. We thought you were the danger." "You weren't protecting the family from me," I said, speaking directly to my family for the first time since entering the house. "I was trying to protect families like ours from people like them." Agent Chen opened another folder, this one containing commendations and recognition letters that I'd never shared with my family because of security protocols. "Your daughter has helped prevent 3 domestic terrorist attacks over the past 2 years. Her analytical work has led to the arrest of 17 individuals who were planning violence against religious institutions, government buildings, and civilian targets." My mother stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. "Zara, why didn't you tell us what you were really doing?" "Because I couldn't, Mom. Most of my work is classified. I tried to explain that my job was important, that it involved protecting people, but I couldn't give you details without violating security protocols." Elena looked up from the surveillance photos she'd been studying. "The night you told us to stay away, you tried to explain that you didn't understand what you'd done wrong." "Because I hadn't done anything wrong. Everything you'd been told about me was fabricated by people who wanted to neutralize me as a threat to their operations." Agent Rivera stepped forward with the most damning piece of evidence. The Patriot Reformation Network identified Zara as a primary target because her work had cost them over $2 million in operational funding and led to the arrest of key members in their financial network. They didn't target her randomly. They targeted her specifically because she was exceptionally good at her job and represented a serious threat to their criminal activities. The room fell silent again as my family absorbed the full implications of what they were learning. Their daughter, sister, and aunt hadn't been associating with dangerous people. She'd been one of the people working to stop dangerous people from hurting innocent families. Miguel, who had been standing quietly near the door throughout the presentation, finally spoke. "Agent Chen, what happens now? Are we still in danger? Are the children safe?" "The immediate threat has been neutralized. We arrested Thomas Brennan and 5 other network members yesterday morning. But we need your family's help to ensure that the remaining members of this organization are brought to justice."
What kind of help? Elena asked, her protective instincts still engaged even as she processed the revelation that the threat had come from the people she'd trusted rather than the sister she'd rejected. Agent Wong answered, "We need you to understand that your experience isn't unique. This terrorist organization has used identical tactics against 47 other federal employees and their families. Some of those families are still living with the fear and isolation that you experienced. We need you to help us show other victims that the lies they've been told can be exposed and the damage can be repaired." I looked around the room at my mother, Elena, and Isabella, seeing them clearly for the first time in 2 weeks. They weren't the people who had rejected me. They were victims of the same psychological warfare campaign that had targeted me. They'd been weaponized against me by people who understood exactly how to exploit their love for their family. "Zara," my mother said, rising from the sofa and walking toward me with tears in her eyes, "can you ever forgive us for not trusting you?" "Mom," I replied, accepting her embrace for the first time in 2 weeks, "there's nothing to forgive. You were protecting your family the only way you knew how. You just didn't know who the real threat was." The confrontation was over, but the real work of rebuilding our relationships and helping other families trapped in similar deceptions was just beginning. 3 weeks after the confrontation at Elena's house, I found myself in a position I never could have imagined when this nightmare began, sitting across from Thomas Brennan in a federal interrogation room, no longer his victim, but the analyst whose work would ensure he spent the rest of his life in prison. The transformation was profound and surreal.
The man who had systematically destroyed my family relationships now sat handcuffed to a metal chair, flanked by his public defender, and facing federal terrorism charges that carried a potential life sentence. The power dynamic that had defined our interaction for months had been completely reversed. "Mr. Brennan," Agent Chen began, "you've been read your rights and you've chosen to waive your right to remain silent. We're here to discuss your involvement with the Patriot Reformation Network, and specifically, your targeting of federal employee Zara Lopez." Brennan looked older than he had in the surveillance photos, with dark circles under his eyes and the pale complexion of someone who'd been in federal custody for 3 weeks. But what struck me most was how ordinary he appeared. This wasn't the imposing figure who had terrified my family with his authoritative presence and convincing credentials. This was just a bitter, failed ex-cop who had found purpose in destroying other people's lives. "Before we begin," Agent Chen continued, "I want Mr. Brennan to understand exactly who he was targeting. Ms. Lopez, would you please state your current position and security clearance for the record?" I looked directly at Brennan as I spoke. "My name is Zara Lopez. I'm a senior counterterrorism analyst with the Department of Homeland Security, holding a top-secret security clearance with special compartmented information access. For the past 6 years, I've specialized in domestic extremist threat analysis and have contributed to investigations that have prevented multiple terrorist attacks across the Mountain West region." Brennan's expression shifted slightly, and I could see the first flicker of understanding cross his face. The woman he dismissed as just another government bureaucrat whose life could be casually destroyed was actually someone whose work had serious national security implications. "Ms. Lopez," Agent Chen continued, "please tell Mr. Brennan about the impact his actions had on active counterterrorism operations." I opened the folder I'd prepared, containing details that would have been classified just months earlier, but had been declassified specifically for this interrogation. "Mr. Brennan, your psychological warfare campaign against me and my family began on March 15th. During the 6 weeks that followed, while I was dealing with the emotional trauma of losing my family relationships, my analytical productivity dropped by approximately 40%. I showed him charts that quantified the impact of his operation. 3 active investigations were delayed because I was unable to maintain my usual focus and analytical precision. The delay in completing the financial network analysis for Operation Mountain Shield allowed 2 suspected extremist operatives to transfer $150,000 in funding before we could freeze their accounts. The room was completely silent, except for the humming of the fluorescent lights. Brennan's public defender, a tired-looking woman named Patricia Holloway, was taking notes furiously, probably realizing for the first time the federal government's case against her client was far stronger than she had anticipated. More significantly, I continued, "Your operation forced me to withdraw from the Regional Threat Assessment Conference in Phoenix, where I was scheduled to present analysis that could have helped other field offices identify similar extremist networks in their jurisdictions. That presentation has been delayed by 4 months, potentially leaving other communities vulnerable to the same types of threats your organization posed." Agent Wong stepped forward with another folder. "Mr. Brennan, we've also calculated the cost of the FBI resources required to investigate your operation. 47 special agents across 6 field offices have spent a combined 1,200 hours investigating the attacks your organization conducted against federal employees. The total cost to taxpayers has exceeded $800,000. But the real power reversal moment came when Agent Chen presented Brennan with the evidence of what his operation had actually accomplished for his organization. "Mr. Brennan, you claimed to your Patriot Reformation Network leadership that your psychological warfare campaign against Ms. Lopez had been successful. You reported that you had neutralized a significant threat to your operations."
She opened a laptop and showed him intercepted communications from the network's leadership. "However, what you didn't realize is that by targeting Ms. Lopez, you actually accelerated the investigation that brought down your entire organization." I leaned forward, looking directly into Brennan's eyes. "Your surveillance of my family led us to identify your operational patterns. Your fabricated documentation helped us understand your counterintelligence capabilities. Your psychological warfare tactics gave us insights into your organizational structure and planning methods." Agent Rivera added the devastating conclusion. "In attempting to neutralize one analyst, you provided federal law enforcement with a roadmap for dismantling your entire network. Ms. Lopez's analysis of your operation has already led to arrests in Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico. We estimate that your targeting of her will ultimately result in the prosecution of over 60 individuals associated with domestic extremist activities." The irony was profound and visible on Brennan's face. His most successful psychological operation had become the key to his organization's destruction. By attacking someone whose job was analyzing threats, he had provided her with a detailed case study of exactly how his organization operated. "Mr. Brennan," I said, my voice steady and professional, "when you approached my family, you told them I was dangerous. You were absolutely right. I am dangerous to people like you who threaten innocent families and communities. My work has cost your organization millions of dollars, led to dozens of arrests, and prevented attacks that could have killed or injured hundreds of people." Patricia Holloway looked up from her notes. "Ms. Lopez, are you saying that your client's actions actually enhanced your ability to do your job?" "I'm saying that Mr. Brennan made a fundamental error in methodology. He chose to attack someone whose professional expertise was analyzing exactly the kind of threats his organization represented. Every tactic he used against me became data that I could use to understand and counter similar operations." Agent Chen placed the final piece of evidence on the table, a thick folder containing charges against Brennan that had been filed in federal courts across 6 states. "Mr. Brennan, you're facing federal terrorism charges, conspiracy charges, impersonating a police officer, wire fraud, interstate stalking, and violations of federal wiretapping laws. The combined sentences for these charges could exceed 40 years in federal prison. However," she continued, "the Department of Justice is prepared to consider a plea agreement if you provide complete cooperation in prosecuting the remaining members of the Patriot Reformation Network and other extremist organizations you've worked with."
"I keep thinking about that night when I told you that you weren't welcome around the children," she said during one of our family's therapy sessions. "The look on your face when I said you were dangerous. How could I have believed that my own sister was a threat to Marcus and Diego?" Dr. Patricia Valdez, the family therapist Agent Chen had recommended, helped us understand that the sophistication of the psychological warfare campaign made their reactions entirely predictable and understandable. "This wasn't a failure of love or loyalty," she explained during one session. "This was a professional-grade manipulation designed specifically to exploit the strongest bonds in your family." The healing process involved not just rebuilding our relationships, but understanding how those relationships could be protected against future attacks. I'd had to learn to share more information about my work, within the bounds of security regulations, so that my family understood the importance and legitimacy of what I did. They'd had to learn to recognize the signs of psychological manipulation and to trust their long-term knowledge of my character over short-term claims from supposed authorities. More importantly, we'd all had to confront the ways that secrecy and miscommunication had made us vulnerable to this type of attack. My habit of deflecting questions about my work with vague answers had created information gaps that extremist manipulators could exploit. My family's tendency to avoid difficult conversations rather than work through them had made it easier for outsiders to drive wedges between us. The work we had done together had also transformed us into advocates for other families experiencing similar attacks. Over the past 6 months, Elena had become a volunteer coordinator for the FBI's Victim Services Division, helping other families navigate the emotional aftermath of discovering they'd been manipulated by extremist groups. Isabella had used her graphic design skills to create educational materials that helped federal employees explain to their families why their work sometimes required secrecy and how to recognize psychological warfare tactics. My mother had perhaps undergone the most dramatic transformation. She'd begun volunteering at a community center in Denver, conducting workshops for other Hispanic families about recognizing and reporting suspicious approaches from people claiming to be law enforcement. Her experience of being deceived by a fake detective had given her a unique perspective on how cultural respect for authority could be weaponized against immigrant communities. "I trusted him because he was supposed to be police," she explained to one group of mothers. "But real police don't ask you to cut off your children. Real police don't tell you that loving your family makes you dangerous." As we entered the courtroom, I saw Thomas Brennan sitting at the defendant's table, looking significantly older and more haggard than he had during our interrogation 8 months earlier.
His plea agreement had provided valuable information about the Patriot Reformation Network's operations, but it hadn't spared him from facing the full consequences of his crimes. Judge Catherine Martinez called the court to order and reviewed the charges one final time. Brennan had pleaded guilty to federal terrorism charges, conspiracy to interfere with federal law enforcement operations, impersonating a police officer, wire fraud, and multiple counts of interstate stalking. The plea agreement recommended a sentence of 25 years in federal prison. Mr. Brennan, Judge Martinez said, "Before I impose sentence, I want to address the nature of your crimes. You didn't just target federal employees doing their jobs, you attacked the families who support them. You weaponized love, trust, and protective instincts in service of a terrorist organization." The victim impact portion of the sentencing allowed me to address Brennan directly for the final time. I stood at the podium, looking out at the courtroom filled with federal agents, family members, and other survivors of similar attacks. "Your Honor, Thomas Brennan tried to destroy my life by destroying my family relationships. He succeeded temporarily. For several weeks, I was isolated from the people I love most, convinced that my own family saw me as a threat rather than a protector." I turned to look directly at Brennan. "But what you failed to understand, Mr. Brennan, is that attacking my family didn't just hurt me. It motivated me to become even more effective at the work you were trying to stop." I detailed how the investigation of his operation had led to new protocols for protecting federal employees and their families, enhanced training for recognizing psychological warfare tactics, and improved communication systems that allowed agents to share appropriate information with their loved ones. Your operation also led to the prosecution of 63 other members of domestic extremist organizations across 6 states. The intelligence you provided during your plea negotiations has helped us prevent 4 additional attacks that were in planning stages. Elena stood up from the gallery when I called her forward. "Your Honor, I'd like my sister Elena Herrera to address the court about the impact on families." Elena approached the podium with the confidence she'd developed through her victim advocacy work. "Mr. Brennan convinced me that protecting my children meant cutting my sister out of our lives. In reality, my sister's work protects families like mine every day. The real threat to our safety came from people like you who try to turn families against the federal employees working to keep our communities safe." Isabella followed with her own statement, and then my mother, each of them describing how they'd transformed their experience as victims into advocacy for other families facing similar attacks.
Judge Martinez listened carefully to each statement before delivering her final ruling. "Mr. Brennan, your crimes represent a particularly insidious form of terrorism, one that attacks not just individuals, but the social bonds that hold our communities together. The sentence of this court is 30 years in federal prison, to be followed by 10 years of supervised release." The sentence was longer than the plea agreement had recommended, reflecting Judge Martinez's view that psychological warfare against federal employees' families represented a serious threat to national security. As Brennan was led away in shackles, Agent Chen approached our family. "Zara, there's something else you should know. The protocols we've developed based on your case are being implemented nationally. Every FBI field office, every DHS regional office, and every other federal law enforcement agency is now training their personnel to recognize and respond to these types of psychological attacks. Your experience as a victim became the foundation for protecting thousands of other federal employees and their families. The people who tried to destroy your effectiveness have actually made the entire federal law enforcement community stronger." Walking down the courthouse steps after Brennan's sentencing, surrounded by my family and the federal colleagues who had become friends, I realized that the terrorist organization's attack on me had backfired in ways they never could have imagined. They'd tried to neutralize one analyst, but instead they'd helped create a nationwide defense system against their own tactics. The dangerous woman they'd tried to destroy had become exponentially more dangerous to people like them. And now I had an entire network of family, colleagues, and fellow survivors working alongside me to ensure that what happened to us would never happen to other families again. 2 years after Thomas Brennan was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, I stood in the same parking lot where I'd received my mother's devastating phone call, but this time I wasn't alone. Marcus and Diego, now 10 and 8 years old, were helping me carry boxes of educational materials into the new Federal Family Security Center that had been established in Aurora, Colorado. Tia Zara, why do we have to learn about the bad people who lie to families? Diego asked as he struggled with a box of pamphlets that Agent Chen and I had developed for children whose parents worked in federal law enforcement. Because knowledge is power, mijo, I replied, using the same phrase my father had always said when we asked him difficult questions. When you understand how bad people try to trick families, they can't trick you. The Federal Family Security Center was perhaps the most tangible legacy of what had happened to our family. Located just 20 minutes from Millbrook Heights, it served as both an educational resource and a support network for the families of federal employees throughout the Rocky Mountain region. What had started as a response to one family's trauma had evolved into a national model for protecting the personal lives of those who dedicated their professional lives to protecting others. Elena emerged from the building, carrying Marcus's forgotten water bottle and wearing the confident smile that had replaced the worried expression she'd carried for months after discovering how thoroughly we'd all been manipulated. Her transformation from elementary school teacher to director of family advocacy for the FBI's Rocky Mountain region had been one of the most remarkable outcomes of our ordeal. The afternoon workshop has 43 families registered, including 12 who've been approached by suspicious individuals claiming to be law enforcement in just the past 6 months. The ongoing threat was real and persistent. The Patriot Reformation Network's techniques had been adopted by other extremist organizations across the country, and new cases of psychological warfare against federal employees emerged regularly. But now there were systems in place to recognize, respond to, and counter these attacks before they could destroy families. Isabella emerged from the building, her artistic talents having found new purpose in creating visual materials that help both children and adults understand complex concepts about manipulation and security. Her latest project was a series of comic books that taught kids how to recognize when someone might be lying about their parents' work. Mom's inside setting up for the Spanish language workshop, Isabella informed us. She's got 32 people signed up, including Mrs. Rodriguez from our old neighborhood. My mother's evolution from hospital nurse to community education coordinator had been perhaps the most surprising development of all. Her experience of being deceived by a fake detective had given her a unique credibility when talking to other immigrant families about these threats. She'd become one of the most effective advocates in the region for helping vulnerable communities recognize and report sophisticated manipulation tactics. "You know what I realized yesterday?" Elena said as we walked toward the building together. 2 years ago, I was terrified that maintaining contact with you would put my children in danger. Now I'm helping other parents understand that cutting contact with their federal employee family members is exactly what puts children at risk. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The extremist organization that had tried to isolate federal employees from their families ultimately created stronger, more resilient family units that were far more equipped to recognize and resist future attacks. As we entered the center, I saw Agent Chen setting up equipment for the afternoon's presentation on recognizing advanced social engineering attacks. She'd been promoted to Assistant Director for Domestic Security Operations, largely based on her success in developing new protocols for protecting federal employees and their families.
Zara, the Washington office called this morning, she said as she tested the microphone. They want you to present your family security protocols to the International Association of Chiefs of Police next month. Apparently, local law enforcement agencies are dealing with similar attacks against their officers' families. The reach of our work continued to expand. What had begun as a response to one terrorist organization's attack on my family had evolved into a comprehensive understanding of how extremist groups could weaponize personal relationships against law enforcement and government employees at every level. My own career had flourished in ways I never could have anticipated. My promotion to Regional Director for Domestic Threat Analysis had made me one of the youngest senior executives in the Department of Homeland Security. More importantly, my specialization in psychological warfare tactics had made me a national expert on protecting federal employees from personal attacks designed to undermine their professional effectiveness. "The funny thing," I said to Agent Chen as we watched families begin to arrive for the afternoon workshop, "is that they really were right about me being dangerous, just not in the way they thought." Miguel arrived with several other fathers who'd formed their own support group for spouses of federal employees. His experience of watching his wife struggle with guilt and fear after our family's manipulation had motivated him to help other families navigate similar challenges. "How's the new caseload?" he asked, referring to my current work analyzing an uptick in psychological warfare campaigns against federal employees working on election security issues. "Busy, but manageable," I replied. "The good news is that we now have systems in place to identify these operations much faster. What used to take months to recognize and counter, we can now address in weeks." The afternoon workshop brought together families from across the region, including several who were currently experiencing suspicious approaches from people claiming to be law enforcement. Watching Elena help a frightened mother understand that the FBI agent who had told her to avoid contact with her daughter was likely a fraud, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from turning personal trauma into protection for others. During the break between presentations, I found myself in conversation with Maria Santos, a DHS border security agent whose family had been targeted by a campaign remarkably similar to what we'd experienced. "Agent Lopez, I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice emotional. "If your family hadn't gone through what you did, if you hadn't developed these educational materials, my family would have fallen for the same lies. My teenage son would still think his mother was associating with criminals instead of catching them." These conversations happened regularly now, reminders that our painful experience had created protections that were literally saving other families from destruction. As the day wound down and families headed home with new knowledge and resources, I stood with my mother, Elena, and Isabella in the center that bore a small plaque dedicated to the Lopez family, first survivors, forever advocates. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Mrs. Kellerman hadn't called you that day?" Isabella asked. "I think about it sometimes, but then I realize that wondering about alternate timelines isn't as important as focusing on what we've built from what actually happened." My mother, now 70 and more energetic than she'd been in years, looked around the center that had grown from our family's crisis. "Your father would be so proud," she said, "not just of what you've accomplished professionally, but of how you turned something meant to destroy our family into something that protects other families." Walking to our cars as the sun set over the Rocky Mountains, I reflected on the complete transformation that had occurred over the past 2 years. The extremist organization that had targeted me because I was effective at analyzing threats had ultimately made me far more effective than I'd ever been before. They'd attacked my family relationships and ended up creating a family unit that was stronger, more communicative, and more resilient than ever. The woman they'd called dangerous had indeed proven to be dangerous to people who threatened innocent families and communities. But I was no longer dangerous alone. I was dangerous as part of a network of survivors, advocates, federal colleagues, and family members who understood that protecting democracy meant protecting the people who serve it. The phone call that had shattered my world 2 years earlier had ultimately led to building something much more meaningful than what we'd had before. Sometimes the most devastating attacks create the strongest defenses, and sometimes the people who tried to destroy you end up being the architects of your greatest victories. As I drove home to have dinner with my family, a routine that had become even more precious because of how close we'd come to losing it,
I smiled at the thought that somewhere in a federal prison cell, Thomas Brennan was probably still trying to figure out how his most successful operation had become his organization's greatest failure. The dangerous woman he'd tried to neutralize was more dangerous than ever, surrounded by a family and community that would never again be vulnerable to the kind of manipulation that once had torn us apart.